Just 2 parts to go, part 5 and part 6 for chapter 8, Cumulus Security. Let's jump in. So now what we're going to talk about, now that we understand a little bit of the basic best practices, if you will, the principles of cloud security, in the aspect of redundancy and latency and all of those, and what is a data center, let's talk about cloud security threats and a little bit deeper dive into regulations, bringing in some new regulations we haven't seen, that tend to be specific to cloud. So, cloud computing introduces, as we've said before, unique risks and challenges because of the ready availability of our data. It's accessible from anywhere, right? So, the distributed nature, the shared infrastructure, the remote access, all represent distinct challenges as it pertains to securing cloud-based systems, as well as new threats to cloud-based systems, right? Suddenly, a DDoS attack on your network affects who? You. A massive DDoS attack on a data center affects who? Thousands, if not millions, depending on the data center, right? So understanding these threats, adhering to regulatory requirements, all critical, all part of the functionality all part of the job function of a digital defender, a cybersecurity professional, if you will. So looking at threats, advanced persistent threats that we've already talked about, huge in the cloud. Okay, so, again, easier to hide if there's not all this maintenance, easier to hide when there's so much network traffic that we don't see the abnormality that we might see in doing a network analysis of our local area network. We're not doing a network analysis on the data center's network, right? So that's why it's important to have proactive services such as IPS, IDS, SIEM, etc. in place for cloud. Okay, these are sophisticated. They are continuous attacks. The attacker tends to get in and stay in, giving themselves time, sealing up their tracks so we can't see where they're going. Really important to understand APTs as it pertains to cloud computing. Ransomware attacks, again, suddenly have a bigger impact. It's not just about, infecting an email server. It's about infecting an entire network. Thus, remember that if we have cloud infrastructure and say an attacker gains access to our local area network and our network has access to cloud resources, those resources are at risk as well for attack, right? I mean, the virus that is going to implement the encryption of our data is going to traverse the network. And again, if cloud is part of that network, it is at risk. So, ransomware operators target cloud services and storages due to the valuable data and the amount of data and the number of organizations that are affected. Bring us back to Snowflake, that data center, that provider who got hit, who now, potentially 135 of their clients, high-end clients, right, are at risk, and some of them have already incurred a ransomware attack. So, there's a great example there if you want to do more research. Supply chain attacks. So, we saw this with SolarWinds. We see it with Kaseya, VSA ransomware. So, 2021 compromised the IT management software, deploying ransomware to thousands of businesses. Okay. And this should actually, let me change this format so it looks correct. There we go. The power of a recording. Mitigation, right? Organizations must rigorously assess the security practices of their cloud providers and any third-party software integrated into their systems, into the systems that we're using for cloud services. All right. So, in this case, right, they gain access and they use the deployment software to deploy the ransomware across many customers. So, huge risk there. And of course, a lot of this is going on and we may not even realize it. So security misconfigurations, errors in configuration. This can be an error in code. It can be an error in leaving a port open on an advanced firewall. Of course, if we open the port, we've basically said the door's unlocked, come on in. Right? So really important to manage those, have policies and procedures in place. That if someone is say working on a firewall, there's a second person watching them. There is a second person who audits what they say they did. Logging is turned on, so we know what that person did. As well as policy that, we opened this port to do some testing. Now we need to close that port immediately. Preferably that testing gets done on a test lab and not production devices, but sometimes it has to happen in production. Okay. Publicly accessible cloud storage buckets, mismanaged encryption settings, again, prevention, audit, right? Putting those auditing tools in place, doing self-audits, making sure that how we say our system is configured, it is configured and may still be configured. So shadow IT has become a big thing. This is the use of unauthorized cloud services, applications, and infrastructure within an organization. So this is where a hacker or someone, maybe even an insider threat, gains access to our cloud services that we are paying for, stores data out there. So, one example of this might be somebody gains access and, suddenly is storing a bunch of game mods out on your file server and giving access to people, thus utilizing your cloud infrastructure and putting it at high risk when unauthorized personnel are given access to, download, upload data, whatever the case may be, right? We're back to audits, we're back to tools, we're creating those baselines, and then when we see an abnormality, we are acting upon that abnormality instantly. This is not just about, say, let me go back real quick. This is not just about having a gas card, right, that you use every month and suddenly, there's 20% more gas on there and, you figure out that your card number's been used by the attendant at the gas station and they're filling up on your card. Okay. Data breaches, so unauthorized access to sensitive data. We hear about these, I think, now on an absolute daily basis. And what's scary is the ones we're hearing about are the large companies that are required to report, are required to make these things public. AT&T just had one, millions of customers' data, etc. Is there reputation damage? There is. I think it depends on what's taken, how large the company is. Is everybody suddenly leaving AT&T and canceling their phone plans? No, it's an inconvenience. It's a risk, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not a reputational damage or a regulatory penalty that is associated with data that gets breached. Okay. Capital One data breach is a great example of 2019, going back a little bit, where misconfigured firewall, that's why I brought it in here. A misconfigured firewall allowed access to over 100 million customer records stored in AWS and Amazon Web Services. So, organizations must again prioritize proper configuration, regular monitoring. I would say regular policy assessment. Are we documenting the changes we're making? Are we updating documentation with the changes that have been made? Okay. And then, of course, as always, swift incident response, that's going to be key. So bringing back some well-known regulatory compliance issues that we know about, GDPR, as it pertains to the cloud, okay, imposes strict data protection requirements on organizations that process the personal data of EU citizens. So requires strong protection measures. We've talked already in the encryption section, there are specific encryption requirements. Data minimization comes into play again. So you're only going to store the data that you need, to store to interact with that customer in whatever aspect it is that your business interacts with that citizen, I should say. European citizen. Okay, requirements, all the way down to continuous monitoring. So there are, select cloud service providers that meet GDPR. So if you're doing business there, you've got to make sure that your cloud service provider is meeting these regulations. If we're a healthcare organization, we have to make sure our cloud service provider, or perhaps even a third-party app that we're going to buy, purchase, use as software as a service that's stored in a data center, it is our responsibility, because it's our customer or our patient data, to know how that organization is storing and encrypting data, how the application is monitored, what monitoring is being done, because at the end of the day, it is us that is responsible for our patient data. Okay, cybersecurity maturity model certification. So this is, again, a framework introduced by the U.S. Department of Defense to enhance the cybersecurity posture of companies within the defense industry base. So again, bringing cybersecurity into the federal government, into governments, securing that data, which should be much more secure than your, say, iPhone photos. You may not think so, but taxpayers do, right? So requiring specific cybersecurity best practices, processes, around encryption, maybe encryption levels that need to be maintained. How do we dispose of servers that we're taking out of data centers? We've migrated the data, but now we've got to dispose of that data that might be DoD data. It might be within a community cloud, within a certain organization, federal organization that operates throughout the country, right? So providing cloud services to the DoD must meet those specific cybersecurity practices. That's really all we need to know. If you get involved in a company that does this, you're going to dive into the weeds on it. So compliance may involve advanced security measures, rigorous assessments. It may require certain vendors in the aspect of IPS, IDS, SIEM, so that you can actually interact and do business with the government. Okay. Finally, there is Schrem's ruling. Now, this is sort of a negative thing that happened, right? It was a 2020 decision by the Court of Justice of the European Union that invalidated the EU-US privacy shield. So it impacts data transfers between Europe and the US, and emphasizing the need for robust data protection. So the Court of Justice, okay, impact data transfers is what happened. So, suddenly we have to do more. We have more compliance that we have to put into place. So organizations must now rely on standard contractual clauses or other legal mechanisms to ensure that GDPR compliance for transatlantic data transfers is happening. Okay, so yes, I know what you're thinking. Well, I don't know what you're thinking. I know what I'm thinking, which is, another ruling, more bureaucracy. But in the end, hopefully that bureaucracy is with the focus of helping securing our personal data, our healthcare information, our data as we deal with companies who should be keeping our data safe. And as we know each day when we hear about the next major data breach that affected 10 million customers, that may not be happening. So again, finally, we'll just end with this for this section, which is additional federal and state laws. So depending on your industry, depending on your location, depending on who you're doing business with, there are most likely other federal and state mandates as it pertains to cloud computing, or that will affect your ability to utilize cloud computing within your business, within data centers, client data protection, encryption, whatever the case may be. So make sure that you're reaching out, make sure you know what federal and state laws, and in the case of, transatlantic use of data, if you're doing business in other countries, what are those laws? What are their compliance strategies that you are going to need to follow? So in the last section, what we're going to be taking a look at is future trends in cloud security. We are going to look at a little bit briefly on AI and LLM as it pertains to cloud, quantum as it pertains to cloud. So stick around. We'll finish off this chapter strong. Take care.